like to welcome you to this debate we're going to have on bioenergy. I want to thank you all for staying in such a beautiful night and listening to hopefully a very exciting debate. My name is Olof Blomqvist. I work as a Climate-KIC coordinator at Lund University. And this debate is held as part of our Climate-KIC partnership. However, mostly me and my colleague Susanna work more with the innovation projects together with the researchers at the university, but also with the entrepreneurship and education with the students and with people outside of the university, of course, as well. So as a start, I would like to introduce Marko Rummukainen, who manages our partnership with Climate-KIC. He will do a short introduction to the debate. Marko.
It feels a bit strange to say good evening to you all because it's so light outside. But then again, it's the Nordics, the Nordic countries, and well, there's not very much one can do about it. So good evening to everyone. When we talk about bioenergy, we are talking about a lot of other things at the same time, sometimes saying explicitly, sometimes not. We are talking about energy in general. We are talking about climate, of course. We are talking about conservation, nature conservation, ecosystem services. We are talking about sustainable development of societies. We are talking about industry. We are talking about society of a number of things. And this comes tangibly together very, very well when you consider the sustainable development goals that the world is pursuing as we speak. We could start at the energy systems, the goal for energy systems when you talk about the bioenergy, but of course that is not the whole story, because we very rapidly can go into climate. How do we make away with the fossil fuels? What do we replace them with? Biofuels being one of the alternatives there. But of course, when we start talking about biomass, using a biomass, be it on land, be it in waters, we also have connections to what we are using the land for. To grow biofuels, grow forest, grow crops. Do we leave it for the natural systems, ecosystems? Do we want to protect biodiversity to which degree? We also have the industries that want raw materials. It's not only about getting away with the fossil fuels, but it's also replacing raw materials which today are not renewable with something else, biomaterials, not least. One could also add water, of course, water for irrigation of crops, biofuel crops, other crops. One can add ocean is not colored there, but of course we have biomass not only on land but also in ocean. And when we use the oceans produce biomass, we affect the conditions for life, biodiversity, in oceans, the other services we get from the ocean and land ecosystems, of course. And so on and so on and so on. We could go to poverty reduction, for example, because also that is connected to how we use the land, what we use the land for, who uses it, who decides, and so forth. If you consider the climate challenge, we have greenhouse gas emissions, we have the climate system that reacts to greenhouse gas emissions by getting warmer, sea levels rising, ice melting, and so on. And we know that in order to curb climate change, to stabilize the global climate at the maximum 1.5 or 2 degree warmer state, come to pre-industrial, we need to make away with the emissions. Until now, and also you can see the graph, that in this case starts in 1980. There's a black line that shows the actual emissions until 2017, estimates still in this data, and how the emissions should continue developing, the blue lines, a number of blue lines, if we were to stabilize the global mean temperature at 2 degrees, or at most less than 2 degrees above the pre-industrial level. And it means, of course, that are we to do this in a reasonable manner, the emissions need to, they should have culminated or reached to rapidly go down. We should be at net zero around mid-century, just after, and we should be at net negative. There should be a way of getting carbon dioxide out from the atmosphere for example, by use of biofuels and carbon capture and storage technology of BECCS, which is one of the alternatives that this has most, seems to have promise of the alternatives we know today. This, of course, at the same time when the consumption, energy, welfare will keep increasing in the world, which so far have been fueled by fossil fuels and now have to be fueled by something else. And where we are today, well, emissions have still been growing. We still live in a world where energy consumption is derived from coal, oil, and natural gas. The three sets of bars to the left, which also show how the energy consumption based on those energy sources has developed during this century, year by year. Then there's also illustrated how much energy consumption is based on nuclear, hydropower, and other renewables, which is solar, wind, and biomass in the industrial society. In addition to this, we of course have traditional biomass, which is also a sizable energy source in the developing part of the world, not least. What it says sort of is that everything that's on the left has to go down, everything on the right has to go up. The total volume should go up as well because we will be wealthier, there will be more people in the world and so on. So this is indeed a challenge. And here biofuels do need to sort of scale up to with the rest when the other things evolve as well. One can also sort of discuss of how complex the issue is, that we have the global issue, we have to get away with the emissions, we need to protect the environment and so on and so on and so on. But going on the ground, it becomes more complex, heterogeneous. There's nowhere in the world where the humankind has not had an influence. The human footprint, which is here shown on land, of course the human footprint also in the oceans. We have changed the Earth's surface in decisive ways all around the globe. In some places a lot, in some places a bit less, but the influence is shown there. This, of course, this also has to be combined that the circumstances are different. The baselines are different in different parts of the world. The level of the standards of living are different in the parts of the world. The challenges are different, possibilities are different in different parts of the world. This also needs to be accounted for when finding solutions on how, on a global scale, to enable sustainable development, clean energy systems, including the use of bioenergy and biofuels. Acknowledging the joint global challenge, but also that it needs to be sort of pieced together, taking into account many actors, regions, and localities, special conditions, possibilities, and well, synergy and challenges, as the panel will now shortly start discussing about. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. I'm Lars Nilsson. I will be moderating this discussion. Bioenergy, what are the possibilities and trade-offs? And when thinking about it, so we have a basic structure for the discussion is to think along the lines of the Talanoa dialogue, which is where are we, where do we want to go, and how do we get there? So that's part of the basic structure. And I'd like to invite the panelists we have today. Henrik Schmidt from Lund University. Yes, please come up. We organized here for... I'll put you at the very end so that you cannot bite me when I'm at this end. Okay. Gustav Egnell from Luleå. SLU. Agricultural University. Lennart Olsson from Lund University also. And Semida Silveira from Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. Also with roots in Brazil, and but no investments in sugarcane plantations or. Okay. Last but not least, Bharadwaj Kumamuru from the World Biomass Association. Please have a seat. and you need to have a mic also. So the idea here is that our panelists will give some short introductions. My idea about the following discussions is that we deal with the land use issues. We're going to deal with the issue of potentials and what kind of conflicts we get into, what types of trade-offs, the topic of, you know, where do we best use the bioenergy? Should it be for heat, electricity, fuels, chemicals, materials? And how does this link also to social aspects and the farmers, landowners, the workers, the farm workers, implications of diets? And we're going to try to do all this moving sort of from a Swedish and European context and then moving into the more global picture. So as you see, it's complex already, and it's bound to be even more complex. Shall we start with your initial interventions as you came up? Henrik, do you want to?
I can start. So
yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was going here to say something about where we are, where we or I want to go, and how I think we could get there. And I would like to start this with a bit personal take on the production landscapes in Sweden, where the bioenergy should come from if we are going to produce it. Landscape change takes time, especially in forest, and it's often very hard to notice the changes. But I recently returned to the roots of my childhood in dark Småland and came back to where I played as a kid a very long time ago. But what was very noticeable was that the landscape had changed dramatically. The old-growth forest was gone. The mixed forest was gone, replaced by a plantation forest of even-aged spruce all over the place. The glades were gone. The forest was dark and closed. And the peat moss was ditched by and close to 2 meter deep ditch, and the whole peat moss was overgrown with pines. So the whole landscape that was once a multifunctional landscape used by foresters, by mushroom pickers, was transferred to a plantation landscape, a really boring landscape, quite shocking. And statistics support my view. The Swedish forest landscape is slowly, or rather faster, or rather transferring into a very industrialized production landscape with even-age monocultures. The same is going on in the agricultural landscapes, where intensification has had a dramatic impact on the structure of the landscapes, as you can see outside Malmö, for example. And this has transferred all the landscapes from multifunctional landscape to landscape focused on the production of biomass, mostly for food, timber, pulp, but now also for bioenergy. So what has this to do with bioenergy production? Bioenergy production in Sweden is still a rather small component of the production. I think it has a number of important implications here. One is that actually bioenergy is used as an excuse for the intensification of both forestry and agriculture in Sweden. It's an argument that we should really utilize the green landscape to save the world, and therefore we should actually produce even harder than before. It is also that some of the production techniques, not all, but some of the production techniques for bioenergy also has the potential to cause biodiversity damage in the landscape if we're not using them in the right way, and especially if we're going to use a very large fraction of bioenergy in society. I think personally that we have a biodiversity crisis at the moment. And I think the biodiversity crisis is on par with the climate crisis. And then we discuss how to develop this landscape. We need to consider biodiversity as much as we consider climate change. And that all the biodiversity strategies need to consider how we at the same time safeguard biodiversity. So in general, I think we need to think about combining bioenergy production in Sweden with increased consideration of biodiversity conservation and other functions in the landscape. But I also think that we should focus on those production forms where we actually can find win-win situations between bioenergy production and biodiversity gains. There are ways to produce bioenergy that actually could gain landscape multifunctionality and biodiversity, but these are often costly and needs then to have very specific policies to be maintained. So in general, we should not use the bioenergy argument as a way to avoid more fundamental changes in our energy consumption, or as an excuse to intensify the production landscape even further than we have done today. Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up. Yes, please. Quick follow-up. Where do you see the potentials for synergies? Is it mainly in agriculture, where you could create more diversity, or is it?
I think you have synergies both in agriculture and forestry. In forestry, you can use it, so to say, to create forests with conservation benefits, especially in southern Sweden. You could, for example, recreate some of the more old-growth broadleaf forest by taking away the smaller trees in the forest. In agriculture, you could use it to clear up some of the overgrown semi-natural grasslands, which are really important for biodiversity, but very hard to maintain and very costly to maintain. Just as two win-win examples.
Okay. We'll get back to this later, of course, and how to get into that situation. But first, Gustav.
I need to challenge Lennart a little bit, because I'm coming from the forestry side, I should say that. I'm at the Department of Forest Ecology and Management up in Umeå. I'm going to take...
So you're a specialist in intensification?
Not necessarily.
No?
Not necessarily. I know our forest history. I know what the foresters were supposed to do up until the 1990s.
Yep.
Increase volume production. That has been the task. There are more tasks now. It's much more challenging. But I want to start with another question. How did we get there? Because we know a little bit where we are, but I just want to go back to the old crisis in the 70s, which forced more or less, or pushed the forest industry to start making use of their residues for energy purposes. Before that, they used oil and grid electricity, more or less, and piled up fibers and old stuff which are still sitting there along the coasts, causing a lot of environmental problems. That was a good thing. It wasn't driven by climate change questions, it's but driven primarily by security of supply, because they were concerned to supply. And today, they are almost self-sufficient in energy production, and they're also delivering energy on the grid. But that happens after, because they didn't have the incentives to deliver anything from the industry. So it came in the early 1980s, when combined heat and power came in as a new market for biomass, and it's been increasing up until now in that sector. And as you did get a price on low-quality biomass, the forest industry started even more to make investments in energy efficiency means, so that they could supply the market with biomass, but they also supply electricity and heat from those industries today, which are very energy demanding. Actually, any forest industry, within a couple of weeks, all the roundwood which goes in is converted to around 40–45% of the biomass is converted to energy immediately. And today, bioenergy is not at all a driver for forest. It might be an argument, possibly, but the driver economically for those who have forests, that's sawed timber. That's 70% of the income for a forest owner. And the rest is residue streams, low-priced biomass. And today, the total bioenergy is fairly big in Sweden. We have around 25–30% of the energy use based on bioenergy. But just a small fraction of that is prime bioenergy from the forest. It's residue streams. And if we talk about logging residues and small diameter trees, it's roughly 10% out of the 130 terawatt hours which goes into the industry. So it's rather small. And what happens when the market's created was also that we did get flooded by other biomass and waste from sources around us, together with the energy efficiency means in the industry, leading to actually a pullback of removing logging residues from the forests. So it's almost down in northern Sweden right now, but it happens in central and southern Sweden still. And the future is more challenging. Where do we want to go? All the ideas about a future where we should challenge the 2-3-degree target says that bioenergy has to go in, and it has to go in the transport sector primarily for fuels. Initially cars, and eventually more into aviation and shipping, where it's more difficult to electrify the fleet. But then we also have the ideas about a growing bioeconomy. So hopefully we can come up with some good products which has much higher value than biomass going directly to energy purposes. That's what we are looking for, and that's what we could hope could at least be a part of the solution for the futures, to come up with those products. And there is always, if you use things wisely, an end-of-life energy possibility, whatever products you produce. So that's a future that we want to see. And in that sort of intensification, I really want to see challenging landscape planning. Actually, where forests meet the agricultural landscapes, and where we look at all sustainability issues, including biodiversity, of course, but there are other issues too. And how to get there? Multidisciplinary research, technical research on new products. And this multidisciplinary research has to focus on supplying policy-relevant information so that we get the right policy in place. And of course, energy efficiency strategies has to be strong. We need to be much more efficient in the use of energy.
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you want to applaud again? Yeah. Everybody, just to warm you up. But the development that Henrik described about the mono landscape and intensification, I assume that's an effect of sort of trying to be profitable. So it's mainly economic incentives. Do you have any idea about, if we could go back to a more mixed forest, more biodiversity, how much would we sort of have to trade off in terms of productivity or whatever?
Difficult to come up. In my word, I hope that we won't have to have any trade-offs in terms of production by doing that, and there is definitely means to do that, because we have quite a lot of stupid concepts in making things simple. Monocultures doesn't have to happen. No. The general public do think that if we don't cut site prep and plant, we won't get monocultures. That's not really true. It's true in some forests, but in the major part of the country, it's actually good to disturb the sites. But what happens after that? The foresters are out with their brush saw and their chainsaw and remove all the other stuff apart from what they planted. They do the same as people do in the gardens. But the options are enormous. So we can definitely create mixed forests. Out-thinning, kill trees when you're out-thinning. Kill the tree standing, no problem. Canopy closure, probably one of the most important ones when it comes to pushing back biodiversity. Create openings.
What did you say now?
Open up the canopy. It makes more clearings in the forest. Because looking at the history, that's actually, although you say older forests are gone, old forests are still there. They might look a bit more boring than they used to do. But hasn't changed that much in terms of age, but standing stock has doubled, tripled, so it's really dark, and that makes a difference.
Lennart?
Okay, I will shift the focus a little bit, because I will mainly talk about the perspective from the global south, and also talk about how we got here. If we go back to the 1990s, when climate change became started to become a political issue, it was so dominated by energy experts. And energy is power, we know that.
So energy experts had the power to sort of define the problem of climate change, and the problem was in energy. After a while, they realized that there needs to be severe or serious cuts in fossil fuel, and they suddenly discovered the world is big. There are lots of hectares out there where we can grow things. And they made a number of scenarios for how much bioenergy we can produce in the world. And some of these scenarios were extremely, it's just fantasy, many of them, both in terms of the acreage that was available and the kind of productivity that could be achieved. And they also made up a story that most of the people living there, they will actually benefit from it. And that narrative has been very, very hard to change or to get a more nuanced picture. It still lives with that. So if we look at the latest IPCC assessment, AR5, 87% of all the scenarios, there were 115 scenarios used, almost all of them, they take for granted that it is possible to have negative emissions, and most of that will be based in the global south. And I think that the reason why Marco can show these pictures, saying that we have to go to negative emissions, that is because very early on the scholars, dominated by energy people with rudimentary knowledge about geography, ecology, agriculture, they created some kind of a moral hazard, that it is possible to solve the problems down south. And that has made the energy experts today thinking, okay, we can probably do that. We can count on future negative emissions based in the global south. I would say that land as a resource is becoming increasingly scarce for many reasons. And there's also a very extreme uncertainties around it. So even if it would be possible to plant these enormous areas of bioenergy in the global south, some scenarios talk about an area the size of India that should be forested. Then I lost. I had a main point about it. but it's sort of...
well, it's a lot of
yeah,
land,
yeah.
obviously,
yeah.
which is not there.
So
Yeah.
there are possibilities of doing things to the lands in the global south that are absolutely beneficial, and they are with great synergies with climate change mitigation and adaptation. But the amount of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases that the amount of mitigation can be created are far less than has been assumed in most of the energy scenarios that we're using today.
You've done a lot of work in Africa, right? Do you see the previous introductions talked about the potential for synergies and that it doesn't have to be all bad? Do you have any good examples where it worked?
There is too much focus on the carbon that can be stored above ground, and too little about what the carbon we can store below ground. Because carbon stored below ground in the soil is much more useful for the landowners, the land users. And it's much slower to release it. I mean, the carbon we store above ground, you need a match or a lightning or some kind of accident, and then poof, everything goes up in smoke in a couple of hours. But carbon stored through better land management in the soil is actually doing a lot of good things for agriculture, for the local economies, and it's very much slower to release. It cannot be released by accident like that. But I think we have to be much more realistic about how much can we mitigate in the global south.
Yep. Thank you. Samida, you are a key person here tonight because you live in Sweden, you've been working here for many years, but you also have some insights into the situation in Brazil. So you are a bit of a bridge in this game to make that connection. But please, your introduction.
Thank you. Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. As we have already noticed, it's quite complex. You have many entry points in this discussion, and I'd like to start by saying that from the point of view of what bioenergy is, we have seen the inputs related to the relationship with forestry in particular. But wherever you go, you will see a relationship with bioenergy in one way or another. Because as long as we eat, we have biomass. And I think the discussion has become very much whether we do biofuels, we do energy, or we do food, or we do wood. But I think it is that's part of the problem with this debate, because the great potential of bioenergy is in the synergies. Mm-hmm. This is where it is. And then, of course, we have been seeing a lot of extension plantations focused on one single product, talking about the multifunctionality. But if we have the multifunctionality in mind and the biodiversity in mind, we will explore the synergies instead of talk about, in energy. I have this discussion because I'm in the energy forum, and people talk about energy very much as energy transformation. Mm. So whenever I say I'm a professor in energy systems planning, everybody asks, if a person is outside, they will ask, what kind of energy or what kind of technology do you work with? And I say, well, any kind, because I'm in the planning side, any kind. And in bioenergy is also, what you can get of bioenergy and how you can use it. You can use it for all modern applications that we have today. But when I started with this, it was in the 80s, and all books about biomass that I found when I was at IASA, they talked about the wood fuel crisis in Africa. And still today, most of the people, when you talk about biomass in Africa, think about making efficient cook stoves. And we're standing there. I read many NDCs, the national determined contributions from sub-Saharan countries, and 2 of them have considered biomass. 2. Mm-hmm. Nobody else. And we are talking about the development of agriculture in Africa, where nothing happened there for 50 years. I have looked at the numbers. Nothing happened for 50 years in most places. It's happening now. And when you develop the agriculture, you will have biomass that can be used efficiently. So I think bioenergy is about resource efficiency. So if you think it in the interface between agriculture and all the other opportunities that you have around, instead what you have is mountains. You go to a sawmill in Ghana, you have a mountain of sawdust outside, just a real problem. Or you see a lot of waste when people don't even have proper energy to cook, or let alone electricity. So all that can actually, if you think the synergy, if you see the energy, instead of we have to bring energy as infrastructure that will make things possible, we see energy as a vector of development. So if we integrate bioenergy into the development of agriculture, development of forestry, development of waste management in the cities, because this is a typical entry point for bioenergy in cities, then suddenly it becomes something completely different than simply thinking of an infrastructure. It's about employment. It's about, you know, I just came back from Malaysia. I thought I was going to see lots of tropical forest. And I was very disappointed, I must say. I was really shocked. But that devastation is not only because of biofuels. It's not only because of palm oil. Of course, the palm oil has intensified, but it's not only palm oil. The ground problem is still there. The development problem is still there. Mm-hmm. And bioenergy requires, why don't banks bother about bioenergy? Because the project finance is so difficult. The project finance of this beautiful wind park that we have, you can see here from the top roof, is quite simple. The day the banks discovered project finance of windmills, it became easy to spread it out. But the project finance of bioenergy is complicated. There are usually many different stakeholders involved, and they speak different languages. And it can be like, you know, for many people you talk about energy, they think electricity. Electricity goes in wires, so, you know, thinking of electricity going through wood is complicated. And it does, because with the residues you can actually generate electricity, you can produce biofuels, you can do whatever you want. But it's a different language, because it's a different sector. So we have to bridge over sectoral discussion, and instead of talking about bioenergy. And even the land, I think the land, of course, there is land scarcity, is a scarce resource. But also the land can be used in a much better. We have been doing work in Indonesia, and we looked at the numbers, what they want to achieve in terms of 30% biofuel, biodiesel mix in the diesel and continuing export, etc. But we calculated it all. And actually, it can go round, but not in the way it is done now. That you have to improve the efficiency, we have to improve the yields, and it's no science fiction, but you need to mobilize efforts actually to achieve that. In Brazil, you mentioned Brazil, then I'll finish this part with this. We have been producing sugarcane for, actually, sugarcane. Brazil was colonized with sugarcane. It's the first industry in that country. Brazil was occupied with sugarcane since 1530, so it was discovered 1530 came the first plantations of sugarcane. And the big program, the modern program for ethanol production was launched in the 70s. But in decades, production of sugarcane has not destroyed the topsoils.
Mm-hmm. Centuries.
Now we're talking about the intensified part on the southeast, because now most of the production is in the southeast. In the colonial times, it was mostly on the northeast. But instead, that sector in Brazil is one, when you look at the agricultural side, is one of the sectors where the where the workers make most money in the agricultural sector, because it's very organized, it's unionized. And when I was a child, the symbol of poverty was the worker of the sugarcane, yeah. And the name, the slang, was the boia fria. Boia fria is those who eat cold lunch, because in Brazil we like to eat warm lunch, and they were the cold lunchers, because we were so poor, yeah. Yet I have visited these people in the field where the warm lunch comes, yeah. So they are very, very organized. The industry has industrialized. Also, I remember talking with my colleagues about this, the mechanization of sugarcane, and they say, "Oh, you cannot talk about this. Where is all these people going to work?" And yet, the mechanization has happened, and with the income increase for workers in the sugarcane ethanol industry. So I think that there are always two sides, and what I'm saying is that it's the debate is extremely polarized. Those who are extremely against, And we see this when we submit papers also for publication. If it goes for a revision, that the person that doesn't like bioenergy, they don't read the paper. You don't get a comment on the paper. You get a position. Yeah? And so either people are for or they are against. And I think, you know, we need here to actually work on the pedagogical side so that people understand that biofuel is not going to, it's not about substituting all fossil fuel in transport, for example, with biofuels, but biofuels and bioenergy is part of the equation, is part of the solution.
Okay, thank you, Sunita. So, Bharat, I suspect you are mildly positive to biomass for energy since you are representing those interests? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, hello. Yeah. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's very nice to be here at this debate. Before coming here, I kind of had a feeling that there would be a more positive or slightly neutral discussion, but when Henrik started with the Swedish case, I had a mini heart attack because from our perspective, Sweden is actually one of the shining examples in bioenergy use and how they've actually maintained, you know, sustainable management of forestry, the amount of biofuels they use in the transportation sector, the waste to energy, combined heat and power. They've all been very good examples and success stories, which we use when we try to promote the message of bioenergy to the rest of the world. So yeah, but then progressively after the other speakers started talking, I had a bit of a relief. But anyway, firstly, I thought I'll briefly mention about the World Bioenergy Association. We actually sit in Stockholm, central Stockholm, and our mission is actually to promote sustainable development of bioenergy globally. We kind of partly represent the interests of the bioenergy industry, partly because we have quite a lot of members, companies, associations, research institutions, individuals who are working to promote or increase bioenergy. So we have about 250 members from 60 countries. So we try to represent that in not just the interest, but also assist them in how bioenergy can be developed sustainably all over the world. So moving on to the debate on bioenergy. There's so much to talk about bioenergy. When you say bioenergy as such, you know, you look on the left side, you've got the feedstock, you've got agriculture, you've got forestry, you've got waste to energy, supplying, you know, biomass to various technologies. On top of my head, I can count probably 10 different technologies: pyrolysis, gasification, combustion, incineration, anaerobic digestion, whatever. There's so many technologies which use bioenergy to produce products like pellets, biofuels, biogas, wood chips, and all of these can be used in end-use sectors, you know, electricity, transportation, heating. So sometimes it's actually quite insane that we try to deal with all these aspects in under one association, or saying a World Bioenergy Association on a global level. But it's actually even surprising that we try to get all of it together in a 2 hours debate on everything related to bioenergy. But I think we've made a good start, so we'll see how that goes. I had just 3 points I thought I'll add. Some of it has already been mentioned before. Number one, bioenergy is actually the largest renewable energy source globally. Not many people know that. Some people even argue about that. Some people are not happy that I say that. But it is actually the largest renewable energy source. If you look at the global energy consumption, about 19% comes from renewable energy, 14% from bioenergy. So about 2/3 of all energy, renewable energy use is actually bioenergy. So it contributes quite a big share on the global renewable energy scenario. So that's the situation we are right now. Following the Talanoa dialogue. So this is a situation now. What do we see in the near future in terms of the potential for bioenergy? I mean, there are various studies, as you mentioned, which deal with how much can be the potential of bioenergy, how much can the world contribute, how many, say, exajoules it can contribute. We've also done our study, but there are also various other international studies. From our study, which was focused on expert opinions, we say globally right now it's about 50-55 exajoules. That's the global supply. What we see in 20 years, we've done a study, is that you can actually triple the amount of bioenergy from 50 exajoules to 150 exajoules. For the Swedish audience who usually prefer it in terawatt hours, 50 exajoules I think would be about 14,000 something terawatt hours. So we can, that's the situation now globally, so we can actually triple it. So that's what we see as a potential. It's not just from the World Bioenergy Association. Some of you can say, okay, we are biased, but it's not just from our association, but other international agencies which kind of agree that, you know, this is a ballpark figure we can use, which could be a sustainable contribution of the bioenergy sector to the global energy system. And that leads me to the third point. How do we do that? I mean, what are the sectors, what are the feedstock which has a lot of potential without much conflicts to contribute to this energy system? Number one is agriculture sector. Right now, the agriculture sector contributes about 9 to 10% to the global energy, global bioenergy supply. You know, this comes mainly from, say, sugarcane to ethanol, biodiesel, biogas, all from the agriculture sector. So about 10%. But what we see going ahead is that there's immense potential to actually use agricultural residues, which hasn't been mentioned. Straw, husk. You know, when you talk of these developing countries of India and China and Africa, when they start realizing how much there is potential to use these residues to energy, that would be a big contribution we see in the near future. And it's already happening when we talk with our members and we talk with our with the local stakeholders on that. They've realized that there is potential to use these residues to replace, for example, say fossil fuels, or to prevent air pollution. I don't know, some of you might have heard the problem we had in Delhi, for example, last year when they burned the agricultural residues in the field, and that means it leads to so much air pollution. Cities kind of shut down because you can't go out. So you can actually use some of those resources, residues, to produce energy in combined heat and power, for example. So we see that's a lot of potential there in the agriculture sector. Second is transportation. You've briefly mentioned about aviation and maritime. If you look at the global picture again, we've done quite well in the electricity sector. I think right now the share of renewables in electricity is about 30%. So we've done quite okay. The same with the heating sector. But the transport sector, we are kind of less than, I think, 5% or maybe 3% renewables. So that is a big challenge. What are the options we have? Electrification, good. I mean, I'm all in for electrification if we can electrify the whole road, air, and shipping sector. But that's not going to happen in the next 5 years, not in the next 10 years, or not in the next maybe 30 years when we're going to use up all the carbon budget we have. So we need all technologies. We need all solutions which lead to lower emissions and which are affordable also. And biofuels are one of the best solutions for decarbonizing the transport sector. So transport sector is again one key aspect coming in the near future. And then finally, combined heat and power. As I said, Sweden is a perfect example for us. We keep shouting about Sweden all the time, and the way they've replaced the coal and oil and gas into biomass in the heating sector, it's actually quite amazing. This is a model which can be used in many other countries. For example, countries where there is district heating, they can use biomass. Where there is not just heating, but also cooling and so on. And just a brief point, you mentioned bioenergy probably is not a big part of Sweden. Right now, bioenergy is actually the largest energy source in Sweden, more than coal, more than oil, more than gas. I think about 37% is the exact figure now of how much bioenergy contributes. So the third point is combined heat and power is another sector which we see. And there are many more. I mean, waste to energy, you've mentioned biogas, which hasn't been talked about, biomethane for transport. We can keep talking on for hours on what are the various resources, what are the various options, and so on. So bioenergy is the largest renewable energy source. There is potential to increase quite a bit sustainably. And there are these three sectors of agriculture, transport, and combined heat and power for district heating or industries, which we see based on our opinion on what could be the role of bioenergy in the near future. There's one final point I wanted to add was on sustainability. I mean, I just wanted to say that, you know, sustainability and, you know, when it covers biodiversity or food versus fuel or land, for me personally, these are all very specific to the context. You know, it's not each of it depends on what you're talking about, which geography you're talking about, because it depends on many local factors, many social aspects, many economic aspects. So everything is very context specific when it comes to bioenergy. So we can't, it's a humble request, we can't paint the whole bioenergy sector under one brush for the whole world. You have to see each case by case basis, whether it's sustainable, whether it's not, and then we have to proceed on that. So yeah, that's basically my opening statement, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I look forward to the debate.
Yeah. So now we know that it's complex, and we know that bioenergy can be done in good ways and in bad ways, and you can have synergies and you can have conflicts. Now, to settle the question of potentials, I'm going to ask the panel whether they think there is potential for more bioenergy in Sweden, and whether there's potential for more bioenergy in the world. But while you think about that, I'm going to try to find out who we have in the audience. Students or, yeah? International? DTU, okay. Welcome. Do you like it in Denmark? It's good? Yeah. I try to stay on this side. I also see some students here, but also, do we have anyone from industry? Not really. No? And over here, also some students, and you, I know, you're working on, yeah. So, in the audience then, how, if I ask how many are seriously concerned about the development of bioenergy, just concerned, or not particularly concerned? So you have three choices: problem, neutral, no problem. How many of you think it is a problem, a really serious problem? Hmm? And how many of you are sort of neutral or undecided? Quite a few. Okay. And who thinks it's, you know, we should increase bioenergy and it's not much of an issue? A few for that. We have I think we have a biofuels researcher, or not. You haven't been doing biofuels a little bit, yeah. So you're sort of positive. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we established that issue. Quick intervention?
Yeah, I was going to say, just because something is not being done right, it means it's not good. Forestry policy in Sweden, or energy policy in Sweden, you can date it back from the 1700s, when they were cutting all the forests, you know, and the king decided he was cutting too many forests and stopped it. So we've been there, and now we have more forests standing in Sweden than we had 10, 20 years ago, because it's growing faster than it's been used. Now, the issue of diversity, I agree with you, it's a real problem. And this is also a problem in areas where we have seen the palm oil or you take out the tropical forest and you substitute by a uniform type of forest, a secondary forest that does not have the same quality as the original forest. So this is really an issue. But just because it's not being done right, it doesn't mean it's not good.
It could be done in a good way. So, so for the questions, if you think bioenergy use in Sweden should increase, then you raise your hand. Neutral, you hold it like this, and decrease, you do like this. So should we increase in Sweden the use of bioenergy? We already have about, we can increase a bit on this.
Sure, it's a bit strong, but we can.
Good, we can. So there's potential to increase a little bit, and you're a bit more careful than not. What about if we take the global situation, where you talked about around 50, 55 exajoules today? Sweden is actually about half an exajoule.
Yeah, well, 1%.
Yeah, it's 1%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you think? If we go globally, now we're in a bigger, yes, yeah, and
it's such a
it depends.
complex question.
It depends. Yes.
It depends on how
Yes.
it's done.
But it's
No,
my
but
task to
today,
simplify it
today
today.
we are. I had a project in Bolivia, and they are, piling there in the landfill or the waste. And after discussions, and one day the guy in the municipality looked at me and said, "Oh, we are burying money every day." And I said, "Exactly. That's what you're doing. You are burying money every day, because you not only you're landfilling everything." You're not taking any biogas, and in addition, they had a place where they had compost, very nice compost, that they were using actually to stabilize the landfill. So that very nice compost that could have been used in agriculture was being used in the landfill. So this is happening everywhere.
Yeah.
I think I need, because when we are saying that, think that it increases in some heads, that's all over the world. When you say increase, that means land grabbing, cutting down forests. They think we need to harvest more. That's not the case. We need to take care of the biomass that's already there, that is burnt on site, that is already produced. We have to look over all the systems. We have to make use of that biomass and make it more efficient, so we produce more energy per unit of biomass used. So in that perspective, we can increase. So just want to make an exercise with the Swedish case. We have around 130 terawatt hours of bioenergy, 85% with its origin from the forests. With an annual cut around 90 million cubic meters a year, which is roughly what we have, it goes up and down a little bit. That corresponds to 180 terawatt hours in the stemwood. In the forest, we are leaving stumps and slash, which corresponds to another 2/5 of that biomass. So if we could take bits and pieces of that, that would add another 120 terawatt hours, which is out there. Part of that can definitely be used. We are using 10 terawatt hours out of the 120 currently,
Some
and
of
that's logging residues.
Some of it is becoming a habitat for beetles and stuff also. So you need.
It's a carbon store. It's carbon stock which feeds anything. So anything we remove will reduce the numbers of those feeding on them. But we should probably take that discussion more in a qualitative matter rather than a quantitative matter. There's definitely logging residues that shouldn't be removed. And there is logging residues that won't be removed because it's a very costly operation and it's a low-priced commodity. So it will stay there for reasons. But there is more to get. The forest industry uses today 60 terawatt hours. They have had, so far, before the market came in, no incentives whatsoever to be efficient in their operations. On the contrary, we have a deposition tax for organic material. So the least they did get over, the better. So assume 10-20% savings there would add another 6 terawatt hours or another 12 terawatt hours in the Swedish case. If we take that to the global case, we have heard the numbers now, 50-55 XAO. You said it could be tripled. IEA Bioenergy made sort of a roadmap how bioenergy could add to the solution of the climate problem and focus and to reach the 2-degree target. And in their projections, they would like to see bioenergy to increase from the 50 up to 90. So it's not even a doubling of it. And we can almost double in Sweden without taking any more virgin wood. But I'm not saying we should rake out everything that is in the forest, but it puts some perspectives on the possibilities. And open burning of biomass, that happens all over the world. It's not only the developing world. Canada, big forest country, they cut their forests, they actually pull the trees out and delimb them on site, making big piles. Fire regulation says to them, you have to burn it on site, you can't leave it. So they burn it on site. And then they dig up some sand. Same province, Alberta.
Thank you, Gustav. Before you continue to talk, I'm struggling to get some structure in this discussion. I think two things have come up, and there seems to be quite a bit of agreement that you can do this in a good way. You can find the synergies. You can use residues, etc. And it would be possible to have more mixed forests and combine it with more diversity in agricultural landscapes. So I think one topic then which becomes interesting is how do we govern that? What kind of policies do we need to go in the right directions? And another topic that has been brought up in different ways is the work conditions, where, like Semida talked about, farm workers in Brazil now have much better conditions than before, but we also know that things can go in the wrong directions. So that's two topics that I think came out of this. But I'd like to ask the audience also if there is, do you have something on your mind or on your hearts in terms of questions? Yes, at the back.
They see also the opportunities with bioenergy, and that could increase. I mean, you're talking about new techniques, and yet we can get more energy from biomass. But in the same time, we can also see that different industry would like to increase, and also transportation. The politician says that we should not fly less, we should use bioenergy to continue to fly without any reduction. And we have also the other transport fleet. And I think that is a contradiction, because if we say that, yes, we have the technique and we have also the possibility to use biomass and bioenergy, then we can continue to live as we do and not really have the understanding that we also must really decrease the overall energy use.
Yeah, I think that's a good additional question, which also ties into the diet thing, because very much of the agricultural production today is, of course, for feed, for animals. So meat production has a great impact. Okay, we have a question back here also. Okay.
My name is Ruzana Svedelius, and I did research on plant nutrients recycling. And my concern is soil degradation, because we are not putting back all the nutrients what our plant needs. So this is one concern. The other concern is actually what is bioenergy? I have difficulties to find definition, and I made my own definition, because it's energy, and we know that we can't produce energy, we can just transform energy. And bio means life. Biomass is living mass in ecology. So bioenergy should be sun's energy, what is during photosynthesis transformed to bioenergy in biomass. But for that, we need at least 16 chemical elements. Other way, it's not coming bioenergy for food, feed, and fiber. So, definition, please.
Okay. Yeah, I think there are. I don't know if we should go into the definition issue, but.
No, I mean, we usually say biomass is stored solar energy.
Yeah.
That's another way of saying that you actually. Then there wouldn't be a problem of storage for renewable technologies.
That definition, oil is also.
It is, but we differentiate fossil carbon and bioenergy, biomass carbon, because if we go philosophically, you know, when we had been using wood, and if we didn't have to go to coal, if we didn't go to oil, if we didn't go to gas, would there be a problem with emissions and global warming and climate change? Because, you know, bioenergy, deforestation and land use actually contributes quite a little small part to the total emissions. So we differentiate again fossil carbon, the one which is under the soil, and bioorganic carbon, which is above the ground. But that's another debate. I thought I'll add one brief point was to the resources. How much can we do? There was one example I just read yesterday about bushes, encroaching bushes in Namibia, where it's a big ecological problem. There's this rapid expansion of bushes which grow unsustainably. It prevents, say for example, cheetahs and their habitats. It prevents farmers from, helping grazing their animals and so on. So why not use that for bioenergy? I don't see what could be a major issue in actually solving this ecological problem. And there was a theoretical estimate that actually the amount of bushes in Namibia which can be used was about 400 million barrels of oil, which translates to about 2 exajoules, which is the theoretical potential of actually using these bushes for energy. So as I've said, we've done this big global study of 150 exajoules, you say 100 exajoules, but of course it's very hard to estimate a global scenario. So the idea would be to focus on countries, focus on national targets, national resource management. So each country has to have its own data on what could be the resources, and then you can be added. But then we feel there's still a big potential in say mainly in residues and so on. The other aspect was on land grabbing. Somebody mentioned bioenergy and land grabbing. Last couple of, I think 1 month back, I saw an article. There was a 100 megawatt solar power plant in India. And what happened was they've installed, so one day the farmers went and kind of smashed all the solar panels with the big hacks and hammers. The problem, it turned out that they were actually not paid. They were not compensated properly for actually using that land for solar. So solar panels lead to land grabbing. So should we ban solar energy? No, that's not the solution. The solution is actually, how do we better compensate? How do we engage the stakeholders? How do we engage the community? How do they kind of inform them in a transparent way? What are the options? What are the solutions? So again, it's very context specific, technology specific, region specific. So to again paint it in a big brush is not the right way to go. Biofuels doesn't lead to land grabbing. Bad land practices, bad governance, that's what leads to these issues. Not the technology, not the feedstock. For example, the palm oil you mentioned, it's not the fault of these technologies or feedstock, it's how you manage them. Yeah, that was the point I had. But coming back to the question on whether we should fly less or maybe we should use more biofuels, of course, energy efficiency is one big part of these emission pathways, reduction pathways. You need to consume less energy. Right now we use a lot more. So we need to, energy efficiency should be a big part, not just in say buildings, in better insulation or for example, better efficient cars, better aeroplanes and so on. So efficiency, we need to reduce the use of energy, but at the same time 82% of the energy we use is still fossil fuels. How do we replace that? That's a big challenge, and that's where bioenergy comes in, that to cover that use of fossil fuels. But efficiency is a big part, yes, we need to consume less.
Thank you. Henrik?
I think it's extremely uncontroversial that there are a lot of bioenergy sources that we would like to use. To some extent, it will be a question of whether they are economically profitable. I mean, we can use stumps in Sweden at the moment. The forest companies don't take it out because it's no value for money. And what kind of policies do we then have that don't result in an increased energy consumption by, for example, subsidizing energy instead of taxing away the bad energy? But what scares me is when you set up scenarios that are really optimistic about the potential for bioenergy, and then they are used to avoid taking the hard conflicts about, for example, reducing transportation. Yeah. Because when you set up these optimistic scenarios, even if you, in your argument, base it on residues, the amount of residues is then dependent on the total production volume you have. So you have then scenarios for increased production of forestry to, in those energy scenarios, get out more residues. Then you can claim that still is bioenergy not causing a lot of environmental harm, but the actions to actually increase the total production is then causing the harm. So you indirectly get this effect. You get the argument that bioenergy is needed and you need to increase the production in agriculture and forestry. And if you look at Sweden, which is sort of my take here, we have 2,000 red-listed species in the forest in Sweden. We have dramatic declines in the biodiversity in forestry. We have lost about every second bird in agriculture in Sweden during the last 35 years.
Not species, but number of birds.
Numbers, because that's what you can count.
Yeah.
That's what you have statistics on. So what we actually need is a de-intensification of both forestry and agriculture. Yes, we have more forest in Sweden than we've had in a long time, but that is part of the problem. This is because we have the monocultures that are very close today. That is because we have got large-scale draining in Swedish forest, and we have forest growing on peat moss, well, that it wasn't forest before. So we are claiming something is very good, which is actually part of the problem. And if we are going to have a large-scale de-intensification, that will also affect the total potential for bioenergy. And then we need to make the hard choices in society to actually reduce the energy flow in society. And I think this is particularly important in Sweden, because we are counting on bioenergy in Sweden as if we were the only place in the world. But we are extremely bioenergy rich in Sweden compared to the rest of the world.
Yes.
So if we have a global perspective, we should rather supply the rest of the world with bioenergy and adjust our energy consumption so that this would be feasible. We are now importing we are fantastic in biofuels in transportation, yes, but 90% of it is imported. So we are imported more or less sustainable, often less biofuels from the rest of the world to be sustainable in Sweden. Mm. That's not the way to go forward. We need to make the hard choices at the same time as we preserve the important ecosystem. Mm. One of them.
But I'd like to comment on your argumentation that bioenergy is the big driver here in Sweden, because I don't recognize that. In all debates that I participate, actually the forest industry, particularly the pulp and paper industry, is very, very reluctant, because they think that, you know, this will affect very much the price, and in that case it will compete for resources that will not be enough. So traditionally there has been this conflict is there. It changed a little bit in the nuance, but there is a chapter on that in a book I have on bioenergy, where we took up this, that you could actually have some swaps there in the way you use the resource that would be much more efficient. But it doesn't happen because, you know, you have these separations. And another problem on the flow of the bioenergy for companies that rely very much on that, and in a way it's the same reasoning when we talk about waste energy, which is energy for, like, say, from steel industry that you could use in heating, for example, is that it is related to the other, as in the synergy is both a great opportunity, but it requires a lot of planning, because of course when there is a decrease in the demand for wood, then you have less residues for production of the energy, and then if you rely very much on those residues and you need more of those, maybe you will end up burning the whole wood for the bioenergy. So I would like you to develop
Henry,
that idea on the driver.
I did absolutely not say and do not mean that bioenergy has been the driver of forest intensification or agricultural intensification in Sweden. No way. It's driven by other forces, both by policy and by market forces. And at the moment we are rather modest in what we take out of forestry, and the bioenergy production on agricultural land is rather small. What scares me is when we use an argument that there is such a big potential that we don't really need to change society. We can continue flying flying because there is bioenergy, but the amount of fossil fuels going into the transport sector and including both domestic flights and foreign flights is so big. So if we would use bioenergy to translate that to something sustainable, it will have a dramatic impact either on the import of bioenergy or on our landscapes.
So that brings us back to the political problem again, because these kinds of political decisions are very, very risky to take if you want to remain in sort of charge. To get
what political decisions?
Any political decisions that makes people's life a bit more complicated.
Yeah, like tax
mobility, what you eat and stuff. If you start to toss on that, you end up in trouble. And that is really a problem. And I don't know how the solution looks like. It seems like we have to continue and discuss these problems until the general public realize that we have to take this. Because if you just... Because I can fully agree, there are some serious decisions that needs to be made. Because we need to consume less. And I think no doubt about that. We can
I think we agree on that, so we don't need to debate it.
Yeah.
But one question that I have is, so it seems to be a lot about land management and land use policy and how we govern land use. As we have agreed, it's not the energy that drives how land is used. And what kind of opportunities do you see there to change? Do we need to, if we start in the Swedish context, is it the Swedish forestry policy? Is it how we incentivize forest owners? What's wrong in the system, and how can we change it to get more mixed forest, get more species back, etc.? That's a big question.
What was a question to me?
Or Henrik?
I think again...
Henrik, are you a forest owner?
There are a lot of ideas out there. Yeah. But the problem is it's so ridiculously slow, so you don't see the changes. What we see now is what happened before 1990s. I've checked, and the focus has been very much on final cut, when we really take down all the trees. They haven't bothered too much on what we do during this establishment of the next generation, pre-commercial thinning. That's when we choose the trees we want to remain, and thinnings, because that's when the sort of monoculture structure develops. And we haven't focused on that. And if we focus only on leaving some stuff during clear cuts, so we're leaving trees,
but is the problem
leaving buffers, then we have only clear cut roughly 3.8 million hectares out of the 23. So the landscape is actually flavored of what happened before that. And that was pure volume production. That was the only task the forest managers had.
And that has changed now, so we will see effects in 20, 30 years?
It's about to change. Some of the changes we can see in statistics, but it tends to level out a little bit. And ecologists, they want to see things happen much faster, which means maybe we need to kill trees and do some other stuff. And again, the choice of trees when we are out in the forest is crucial.
But do you think is the problem like inertia with the forest owners, that they do things like they used to do, or is it with the consultants and the bigger companies, or is it in the whole policy structure that's driving this, has driven the intensification and probably still does?
It's not policy, because policy is probably pretty good. It's more that the conservatism which is among foresters, and typically people are out buying wood for the industry, and they could have a very much of a conservative mind, whereas the Swedish Forest Agency thinks a bit broader than that. They're also out telling people what to do, but usually they are not so much involved. So it's very much the production industry interface which discusses what to do. And
if we had Lena Ek here, who is chairman at Södra Skogsägarna,
she would have killed me then.
She could have told us what they tell their members. Henrik, and then we will take a quick question from the audience.
I think there are a lot of things that can be done quite easily to strengthen the landscapes and allow for bioenergy, increased bioenergy use. We could strengthen the conservation of forest with high values. We are conserving more forest than before, but we are cutting down more valuable forest than we are protecting at the moment. So the situation is getting worse, not better, in spite of a lot of resources invested in conservation. We could strengthen the forest conservation law, which is extremely weak at the moment. But we could also think about the certification systems, which could be much more transparent than they are before. Because if you did some things to conserve biodiversity, I wouldn't mind if you took some extra stumps in the forest. At the moment, stumps are sort of replacement for other things that are gone in the forest. But again, I think this argument about saving the climate is coming in here. I was listening to a talk by our former Prime Minister Göran Persson not very long ago, and he was talking about the morass of rules and regulation that hindered the ability of us small-scale landowners to save the climate, and pointed at Natura 2000 key biotopes and other protection measures in the forest. So there's a conflict created here between the...
Göran Persson probably lives in this idea that we can continue as usual, right?
He has strong links to the forest industry.
Also, I should explain the former Swedish Prime Minister. When he stopped as Prime Minister, he bought this big mansion in the country with a lot of forest, and so he's has some economic interest in this.
But he's not an person without influence. And
no.
He mirrors a debate that is going on at the moment.
Yep. Gustav?
Yeah, I have a policy problem with the idea that any forest owner who has some values in their forest should be sort of lose the ability to use the land as they want. Because for some reason it's there. Because if you have that system where you do create things by doing things or by doing nothing, it could depend differently. But you have no carrots in the system, and people becomes reluctant to create those values in the managed forest. Because we are talking about the managed forest, then we can discuss how much we should set aside forever and for eternity and never touch. That's another discussion. But I see a problem incentive-wise, not saying that all the cases are wrong when they set aside private forest owners' land. But we need incentives to create some good values also in the managed forests. Otherwise, we will lose the battle.
Quick comment, Henrik, and then a question.
First, I think there are myths going on here, because in Scania, for example, the forest agency have not forced a single landowner to conserve an area in spite of that not being interested in that. In all cases, that been a voluntary agreement. Not a single case have they enforced this. Second, the key biotopes, the reason that they are controversial is actually that the forest owner themselves went into a certification system and promised not to tear them down. So that is something that the forest owners themselves have arranged. And then when they discovered this was a problem, they sort of regretted this promise. So again, it's not society that forced that on them. It's totally legal to cut down the key biotopes in Sweden.
Question from the audience. We'll see if that changes the game here. Please.
Yeah, Jan Klaff, Lund University. So I do research on the drivers and the consequences of land use change. With bioenergy, I'm a little bit worried sometimes that things will simply not change, because we're talking about we can do this, we can do that. We have, as you gave the example of the king deciding to sort of have less trees cut down. I mean, this is a sort of an idealized situation that you find also in a lot of scientific papers. You talk about potential simulations, whilst in reality you have millions of landowners who sort of make their own decisions, often economic decisions. So why do they burn the residues from the rice? Well, because essentially there's nothing else they can do. Why would they take the time to bring it somewhere else? And the ashes are also can be incorporated into the soil as fertilizer. So one of the things which worries me with bioenergy is not really it's going to ruin the world, is also that actually, so we have these big promises, this big potential, and that needs to be delivered within a few years from now. But probably nothing's going to happen. Do you agree with this view?
That nothing's going to happen.
Well, not enough.
No.
Will happen to get this inflection. Well, to have a significant contribution of bioenergy to this inflection in the emissions.
Reminds me of the piece of art we had in Lund earlier this year, where it said, "Heaven is a place where nothing ever happens." Maybe we're in heaven. Lennart?
I very much agree with your analysis here. But the real problem we have is that we need to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases very, very, very quickly, within a few years' time. So then we need to see how can we do that in the best possible way and to ensure social justice around the world. And to see what can bioenergy do in that, here and now. Okay, there are many sort of unused potentials. We can use the waste bet and things like that, and technology is there, so we should do. But I would also say that some of the bioenergy proponents are actually supporting the interest of fossil fuel industry, because they have created these long-term views that we can solve many problems with bioenergy in 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 decades. And that, of course, takes the pressure off the fossil industry and takes the pressure off politicians, because they say, I mean, this is exactly the moral hazard.
The conception that we can continue to drive.
But I have to react on that.
Please do.
I disagree completely in that respect, because in Europe what we have is that the fossil industry is undermining the penetration of biofuels. And for example, all policies at EU level have been to curtail the market. And I think that, it's not bad to have a market. That's the choice we have made many, many years ago. And the markets are not necessarily bad. We know how markets operate. We know how to create markets. We're trying to create a carbon market. We're not doing a very good job. But we know how to create markets. And we can play with the forces of the markets in the interplay with policies. And the biofuels, I wanted to connect with the aviation issue, because if we had discussed biofuels from the very beginning in aviation, it would have been a completely different story. And I have followed the climate the negotiations from the beginning, and the aviation industry managed to postpone any action in the aviation industry for exactly 20 years. Exactly 20 years. Because it was complicated, it was all international air, and then all because of that, and because of this. But what we see is that we had fewer actors, fewer players in that industry. We had willingness to pay very high, so we could have actually entered that field where willingness to pay was high, and it would have been much less complicated in terms of the investments we have had to have for the permittation of biofuel. Now, to answer your question, I hope it will happen, because I think that if we discuss, as I said, the devastation of forests is not only an issue of biofuels. It was already there. What we have is that we have larger populations, we have countries, we have Sweden is a paradise because we are 10 million people in a very, very large country with a lot of forests. But, go to countries where you have a very, very large populations, like in Indonesia, we have 250 million people. The government is very, very, has to really balance, because the local chiefs are very, very strong in the different islands. It's not such a strong national government that they can just go ahead. They're actually pushing a number of things, but it's very, very tricky to implement things. And if you don't have jobs, you have encroachment, what we have seen in many places.
So we need to balance these forces, the market forces, and I don't think stopping the market like Europe is doing, stopping the market is not going to do it better. On the contrary, I think it's, if we actually are part of the market, if Europe wants to be a leader, as they say all the time in climate, then, you know, being part of the formation of this market. The problem is that in Europe, we know we don't have a big bioenergy potential in Europe as a whole. We don't have land enough, we don't have forest enough. There is still a lot of potential, but I mean, if you look in the whole, so and the politicians have understood that wind power and solar power generates a lot of jobs. So fair enough to that extent. But to close the market and think that now we close and pretend it's not there, it's not going to solve the problem. It's better, as we have seen from this discussion, bioenergy is very complex. It's creating the synergies in a proper way that you appreciate the biodiversity, you appreciate the different complexities. Require a lot of knowledge. It's very knowledge intensive to do it right. But there is still a lot of improvement. In Indonesia, they have a yield of maximum 3.64 tons per hectare, while in Malaysia they have more than 6. So there is a lot of room in the same land that they are already using. So there is a lot to do, but I mean, it's a lot of knowledge, it's a lot of managerial aspects, and the problem of poverty underneath is there. So we need to do that in the context of creating jobs, of creating opportunities.
But you're talking about creating rural jobs and economic development, whereas in other cases what we see is land grabbing and people getting displaced from what people think are marginal lands. So
of
we
course,
have both situations.
I'm not, yes, exactly. I'm not neglecting that. I mean, in Brazil, in the 70s, the government wanted to occupy the Amazon. So you'd get for free 100 hectares, and to show that you were working the land, you had to deforest. If you didn't deforest, you would lose the land, because that meant you were not doing anything. Yeah. So there was a lot of wrong policies. So there are bad policies, there are bad solutions, but bioenergy is proven. It's proven. You can do many good things with bioenergy, and you will choose your entry. You talked about heat and power, but actually in Sweden, bioenergy entered only in the heat market, because in the beginning it could not compete with nuclear power and hydropower. So the entry point for bioenergy in Sweden was the creation of the heat market. And now, or even if, speaking about the energy transformation, doing heat and power at the same time is much more efficient. But there was no room to produce electricity from biomass when there was plenty of nuclear power and hydropower. Now, with a different policy, with the green certificates back, then suddenly heat and power was the #1 choice, and it grew very, very fast, because it makes all sense from the efficiency point of view.
Thank you. You've been quiet for a while. Now you have to. Yeah.
No, yeah. I was just following some of the discussions. There was one aspect of ambition. You know, how ambitious can we be? I mean, it comes to the one of my favorite persons in the data field was the late Hans Rosling. So his son, what he did once, there was news that India would be completely combustion free in the transport sector by 2030. So in the next 12 years, there was news that the government is planning a policy to completely replace all road transport with electric vehicles. 12 years, millions of cars. So he put up a timeline saying, okay, by 2030, I'm going to come back and check whether it actually happened or not. So there's always a fear that, you know, nothing might happen, you know, you don't know. So sometimes I do, whenever I see scenarios, even for the 2035 150 exajoules of bioenergy, I have a clock ticking somewhere that, you know, maybe I'm going to check back after 20 years and see if it had happened or not. But to make it happen, we need to make it happen. I mean, that's absolutely crucial. We need to decarbonize the energy sector. We need to make these changes happen. But why one stumbling block I see is policy. It is very interesting you mentioned there's so much policies and bad policies, but from my perspective there's actually not enough policies to actually promote renewable energy technologies. If you just look at, if you segregate the energy use into, say, electrification, electricity, heating and transport sector, if you look at globally, there was, REN21 had this report where it said 120 countries had actually some policies to promote renewable energy in the electricity sector. In the heating sector, it was about 60 countries. If you come down to transport, it's barely 20 countries. So there's, without policy, strong policy changes can't happen. I mean, of course, as you mentioned, good and bad policies are there, but you need good policies, you need stable policies. But there's also two extremes. You have, for example, lack of policy, but at the same time, too much policy. For example, the European Union and the reduction in crop-based biofuels. Few years back, the first RED, you say, okay, you know what, we're going to have 10% biofuels in the transport. Later on, you say, you know what, maybe that's not a good idea, maybe 7%, and then you drop it down to 3.5%. That's not, that doesn't again help at all. Investments to make, if bioenergy investments to happen, it takes many years. So one extreme is this complete lack of policy in some of these sectors, which is hindering development of bioenergy and renewables, especially in the transport sector. But at the same time, there's too much policy changes within a few years, which is again affecting investments and development. Final point was on energy use. We currently use, I think, about 560 exajoules globally. I completely agree with the points that we need to use less energy. We need to be more efficient. We need to reduce the use of fossil fuels. That's why we had, when we looked at the statistics, we sometimes you hear what renewable technologies have grown quite rapidly. I mean, solar and wind has grown tremendously in the past 15 years. But if you look at how much was actually the share of renewables from, say, 2000 to 2015, probably increased from 17.6% to 18.3%. Not even 1% change in the past 15 years. And why is that? Because we still use a lot of fossil fuels. We still use a lot of oil. We still use a lot of coal. So the increase in the use of bioenergy and renewable energy has to be simultaneously followed by what we call in the Association of Fossil Exit Strategy, that each country has to have some sort of an exit strategy for fossil fuels, some sort of a pathway, a roadmap for each country. How am I going to reduce the coal use? How am I going to reduce the oil and gas use? And at the same time complement it with increasing the renewable energy share. Because if you keep increasing the use of fossil fuels and you keep saying, okay, you know what, we've installed 1,000 gigawatts of renewable energy, but it doesn't matter in the end because the main challenge is climate change and emissions, and that doesn't help unless you reduce the use of fossil fuels also. So I completely agree with that on energy use. And but the point I wanted to make was the potential of biomass of 150 exajoules. I don't think it would drive or assist the fossil fuel industry to say that, you know what, we are fine with that. In fact, it would be very good if the bioenergy industry was collaborating with the fossils. Then we would have a lot of money to work with. But that's not the case. It's always a challenge, competition against the fossil fuel industry, where we keep saying you have to reduce the use of fossil fuels, and at the same time, the remaining energy use we estimate in the 20 years or 25 years should be with almost 100% renewable energy technologies. Yeah.
Okay. I'm still thinking about where we started, the Småland region with the forest. Actually, I should just explain, this is a region north of Scania with a lot of forest, and a lot of Danish people are buying vacation homes. But they don't know that the forest should actually look different from what it looks like now, because they haven't seen the forest that you saw when you were a kid. So that's interesting in terms of landscape change. We're going to take one more question, and I'm also going to ask a question, and it's on this topic of, because we've had this food versus fuel debate, right? But why is there no food versus animal feed debate, or food versus tobacco, or food versus tulips? Why are we growing tulips on the best land? Why is all this focus on biofuels? And this leads me to my question. Do you think, could we see something good in this? Because I would welcome the strong focus on sustainability issues for biofuels, and perhaps that can spill over into general land use, better land use policies. But in addition to that, we'll have a question or a comment from the audience.
Thank you. I have a question regarding clean energy, because I think this is the theme of this evening. And we have over 400 ppm carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at the moment, and increasing. And one way to mitigate is to remove biofuels, the carbon dioxide from biofuels, because then you can produce a sink. When you're talking about biofuels, you're talking about lowering the amount of fossil fuel. That will probably not solve the 1.5 degree problem or the 2 degree problem. I think we have to remove this carbon dioxide from the biofuel to be able to...
You mean storing it geologically?
Storing it or charcoal or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah. Some kind of mitigation.
Thank you. So that's partly the biochar ideas also. And yeah. One more question.
Daniele Pagani from Nordic Focus Center Renewable Energies. I know I will be probably against what is going to be said up to now, but
that's good.
Why considering biofuels and bioenergy so much related to forests? That's the first question, because that's much more. If we take biogas, that comes from manure, you have much better yield. And the second one is, why do we consider keeping on burning when we can use biomass as backup for renewable energies? Because that's not what it is done entirely now, but that's the future of district heating in Denmark, for example. So plants that originally were built for oil burning switch to biomass, straw and wood chips, and then eventually they will switch taking the excess powers from wind, powering an electric boiler, and when there is not enough of this, then you just use biomass. And I will give just a practical example of this. In our center we have a wind turbine which produces more than we need, and it's not convenient for us to put it in the grid because of regulations. So instead of that, we put it in our system to heat up water, just with electrical resistance. And that has driven down the pellet consumption to 30% in a year. So we use pellets when we need them, or any kind of bioenergy, doesn't matter. But for most of the year we use renewable energies, which is clean. So why keeping, I understand that you are focusing mostly on this, but let's start to look at the future and let's see are there other solutions possible.
Yeah, thank you. So broader systems approach where you can fit different things in different places. We only have roughly 10 minutes left, and you have three different...
I didn't realize.
Yeah, time goes fast when you have fun. There are 3 questions, 5 people, 10 minutes. You have 2 minutes each. You cannot possibly answer all questions, especially if I keep talking and using up the time. So you can actually choose yourself what would be your sort of last comment in this. And we'll start with Samira, if you want.
First of all, of course, I don't think we are focusing on a forest. It's just because we have more foresters here. But as I said, you have to look at the synergies. And the synergies are with agriculture, forest, etc. And the more intermittent energy you have, the more base load you need. And biomass is perfect for that too. Yeah. Carbon capture and storage, definitely. You know, Stockholm has the largest district heating system in the world. And it's being planned now, the carbon capture and storage. One of my students, we worked in a first study for Fortum, where we looked at 5 different sites. So it's going to happen. Yeah. And then finally, I'd like to say that it's not only about mitigation. We have to do a lot of adaptation in Africa. My first project in Africa, we had 10 for COP1. The message was Africa wants more adaptation. It took 10 years to come into the agenda. And a part of the mitigation will be in actually adapting different areas for different purposes. And we did a study in Indonesia that showed that some places are becoming too dry for paddy, and they could be used for sugarcane. So there are a number of things. This is so research intensive, this topic. So, you know, the synergies with biology, with the different types of energy. But as I said from the beginning, my take here, my final, is that we cannot discuss bioenergy only about among energy experts, because bioenergy is about so many things.
Thank you. Well said, and within 2 minutes. Thank you. Who wants to go next? Barbara?
We started with the Swedish and then we went global, so maybe we conclude with the global perspective and then have the last word with the Swedish experts.
We end up in Småland again.
In Småland again, yeah, absolutely. BECCS and biochar, absolutely. I mean, maybe Professor Marco could explain more on the carbon reduction potentials and what we need to achieve these emission reduction in the coming years. Frankly, from our perspective, we focus still a lot more on energy and how can we substitute fossil fuels. We've actually commissioned a couple of studies, one on BECCS and one on biochar, which will be out in a couple of months' time. So we're trying to increase our knowledge itself on what is the global potential for such kind of technologies, and especially with BECCS, I don't know how many commercial plants are available. I mean, if it's commercially viable or not, it's again a question of can we do it or not. So we are going to commission some studies and see on that. This very important point on dispatchability. I mean, that's a key benefit of bioenergy. You know, as I said, stored solar energy, and that bioenergy has this extra benefit of being, you can provide power and whenever you want, wherever you want. And a key point in that is also renewables integration. That's what we work with. We don't work only with bioenergy. We have an alliance called the REN Alliance, where we work with the solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, and bioenergy. So 5 leading associations to see how can we best integrate the renewable energy technologies in terms of not just from the cities or municipalities, but also on a national level. Bioenergy is not the solution. You know, all renewable energy technologies have to work together. You know, comparing dispatchability, storage, and these various end-use sectors, electricity, heating, transport, and so on. So there's a lot of potential to do integrating the renewables. Food, you know, I've prepared a big argument because I always get this question: food versus fuel. I'll throw up some numbers.
I'm getting hungry now.
Yeah, we waste 30% of the food we produce.
Yes.
Number 2, we right now use about 60 to 70% less land than we used 50 years ago because of better yields. So that means we're using less land for more food at the same time. And finally, when you talk about prices, we did a very funny graph once. We looked at the food prices globally. We used the FAO price index of food. Then I've exceeded my time limit already. Briefly. So we looked at food prices, we looked at crude oil prices, and we looked at biofuel production. The increase in food prices is very closely correlated to the crude oil prices, not actually to biofuels production. So that's a very important point to note, that it's a completely whole different aspect, not just that biofuel production increases food prices. That's not as simple as that. Finally, I come back to the point, Sweden is a perfect example of a successful story of bioenergy. We need more examples like that. We need more of these Swedish representatives to talk more on how successfully bioenergy has helped in the heating sector, in the transportation sector, in the electrification sector. So just be loud and be confident and just show the success story of Sweden. And because we need that, the world has a lack of good success stories in bioenergy. So we need Sweden.
Okay, thank you. Shall we go through Lennart and then, yeah?
Yes, I'll talk about BECCS, bioenergy combined with CCS. I think this is a very problematic proposal. It is a main reason why we have this moral hazard, because this is something that there are great uncertainties about it, and it's the promise that in 30, 40 years' time we will have a solution. But what we really need, that is to decrease the emissions now. And we know the best way to reduce emissions, that is to let the coal be in the ground or the oil be in the ground. But when people bring in BECCS into this equation, that has taken off the pressure on reducing the fossil emission. So BECCS is, and we don't know whether it will work or not. There are still technical problems. There are a number of very large logistical problems, and there are the problems of social acceptability.
Okay. Thank you.
John, I'll take it from there, because you started with a question about why nothing happens. Low-priced commodity, no policies in place, a lot of piles around, which are very unpredictable. So we don't use all the residues we have yet. So nothing will happen, although you can make numbers about the potentials. For you, forestry, that's a Swedish bias, of course. So anywhere bioenergy comes in depends very much on the energy needs, the other energy supplies you have in that area, and you can fiddle with it and use it in the best way. So it's not a necessity that you use it as we do it in Sweden. And we haven't talked about district cooling yet. That's another need in other areas, whereas we need a lot of heat, which makes it very efficient. Food versus fuel.
Tobacco.
Tulips. We don't. It seems like any time we come to this very primitive way of combusting things, people becomes very reluctant, and then it has to be bad. Fire is bad. Wildfires is exceptionally bad. So we end up there. So for some reason we are blamed for the oil palm plantations too in Southeast Asia, although, again, the driver isn't energy. It's a little bit of the driving because it adds some money to it. But to some extent, we are talking residue streams that might be poured out if we don't combust it. It's not the high-quality oil. I'm not defending oil palm plantations. I'm just saying it's not bioenergy that drives it. And your question wasn't a Beck's question, was it? Or was it more let the forest grow and sequester carbon? Or
it was a little bit of both, actually.
No matter how you burn it, you use carbon dioxide and put it on top of the other. And I don't talk about, oh yeah, the fossil could continue because we're having BECCS. No. We have to, of course, lower the use of this fossil addiction of energy.
Yeah, but as long as we are working with quite a lot of residue streams, it will decompose eventually anyhow, so we can just save a little bit in time, and timing doesn't matter that much. It matters for some gases, but not carbon dioxide. And from charcoal, yes. Yeah, I'll stop it there. You can make charcoal. You can actually leave the forests to grow to, and in the short term, that's a better choice than using the forest. But you'll end up with a number of problems because you have to give up wood use as a whole. It's not giving up bioenergy because there are still very few dedicated cuttings for biofuels only. So the only exception in Sweden is actually chopwood, which is used in individual houses, which is a fair amount, but that's dedicated cutting for firewood.
You can continue the discussion in exactly 2 minutes when we've heard the last word from Henrik.
Back in the
where we started.
Yes.
Take us to Småland.
No. We start in Lund and Scania or Malmö instead.
Okay.
Why is not agriculture? Why hasn't it figured more here? Yeah, in Sweden about 7% of the land is agriculture, so it's pretty simple. The bias you talked about here, but also in agriculture there are many win-win situations. You could use more intermediate crops and lace to as bioenergy, and at the same time gain soil carbon and so on. So there are really many opportunities, and many of those are actually there's a strong development in Sweden and a development in agriculture to use these resources, but there are also conflicts. In some of the scenarios, you count in the use of the fallows in Sweden for bioenergy production because that's unusable land, as if fallows was not a way to actually have a less intensive agriculture, as if it wasn't very important for biodiversity in farmland. So we have exactly the same kind of potential conflicts in agriculture. And in fact, if you look at something called the yield gap, which is a map of where you have the large potentials for increasing agriculture production by being more efficient over Europe. You can, on top of that, put a map over biodiversity connected to farmland, and they are exactly inverse. Because where we have the large potential to increase production in agriculture in Europe is where we have the biodiversity still in place. So we need to be careful also in agriculture not to lose biodiversity. someone mentioned here also that we need sort of assistance perspectives. I think that's really, really important. We need to consider the full consequences of using bioenergy, not only the sort of simple effect of the number of terawatts we can produce from a certain source. And I think one of the most important considerations here is to count in the effects of land use change internationally. I don't necessarily agree with your view about the effect of using palm oil. I think it's actually to quite some extent unresolved what the historical reasons for the change has been. It's been argued in the literature. But if we are going to massively increase the use of imported biofuels for transportation in Sweden and Europe, that will certainly have an effect of land use change globally, with potential consequences for the release of carbon. So we need to consider what are the net consequences of our choices here. And we also then need to consider a sort of element of fairness. It's not that all the bioenergy in the world is going to be used in Europe. There are other people in the world might have less opportunities to find alternatives than we have in rich Europe.
And some energy will be used in Småland also.
Yes.
Cogeneration plant. So for the young people here, this is obviously a good area to go in to work with, because these problems will not be solved in my lifetime, hopefully in your lifetimes. I would like to thank everyone in the panel very much for coming, and we've been going on for 2 hours. Time flies. And thank the audience for your patience and for listening attentively. So we close the session here, and thank you all.